Now let's move on to a higher level example where we have more language available to us and see how the 5 steps may play out. So I want you to keep in mind what those 5 steps are again, right? We have identify a social norm. We have situate that social norm so people can recognize their own connection to that social norm and their experience of that social norm. We then have to include marginalized experiences of that social norm, so that raises some awareness, but also helps some learners identify. We have connect, right? So make connections between the learners' experiences themselves and the experiences of the marginalized people. And then we have improve, right? So a culminating type of activity where they aim to improve something about the status quo to make everybody experience the world better. So think about those 5 as I talk about this higher level unit. Now, are you person A or are you person B? I took these images from that website, Two Kinds of People, and they're quite enthralling. And when I've asked students this myself, it's quite engaging. You get a lot of response and some very heated or emotionally stimulating responses. Are you person A or are you person B? Are you person A? Are you person B? One more. Are you person A? Are you person B? So what this opening task sort of established is that there's a kind of accepted binary choice, right? You're either going to be person A or you're either going to be person B. And I wonder if, in fact, some of you, when you thought about that, immediately identified, oh, for sure, I'm person A. Or maybe some of you were like, well, you know, I don't know. I'm not always A, but I'm not always B either. But it's presented as an either or choice. And so this leads into a question I would have for the learners, which is, where in our daily lives do we often make this kind of choice, right? Where are we expected to be a person A or a person B? Where do we have no option but to choose A or B, because that is just the accepted nature of the choice? One of those that comes to mind are washrooms, bathrooms, restrooms, whatever you want to call them. And so when we think of these washroom situations, there's quite traditionally a male washroom or a men's washroom and a female or a women's washroom. Those tend to be the 2 binary choices available. And in quite a number of situations, we can see variations of these choices represented by the logos or the characters that are drawn on the doors to help identify which is which. And so we can see football is what's identified here for the men's washroom in the one photo, and shopping is for the women's. We can see Batman versus Wonder Woman to help identify. And so I'm sure if you sort of look around your society, you probably can find quite a few examples of men's and women's washrooms where those are the binary choices that you have available to you. But you then also have representations of men and women and masculine and feminine characteristics or behaviors that may or may not be something you personally identify with. The next part of the unit then is to introduce a couple of experiences of washroom situations in society. And so the first then is from this woman who is a cishet female. And so when we say cishet, we're saying cisgender. So in other words, she identifies as the sex she was assigned at birth. So that's female in this case. And het is the heterosexual part. So she also is a heterosexual woman, self-identified. So her experiences are what we're going to hear from first. What we hear in the audio or maybe as a text are her opinions about these washroom choices, in particular, the relationship of the representation to femininity. So she's going to be talking about largely how she sees the representation of, a thin woman with a dress, for example, potentially a white woman, potentially someone who loves shopping, and how those characteristics may seem ridiculous to her. Then we're going to hear a second set of accounts from this person here, who is a non-binary person. In other words, they don't identify either as male or female. And we'll hear about their experiences with regards to washroom choice. So it's going to be a little different than the experiences we saw from the cishet woman just before, but not entirely different insofar as representation is concerned. But of course, their experiences are going to probably involve the lack of choice, right, surrounding which washroom it is that they go into, because there is no non-binary washroom. I don't know if that is the solution, but they may talk about how they feel uncomfortable going into either the men's washroom or the women's washroom because of how they present, because of the way people will react to their presence in either one of those washrooms. Potentially they hold their need to go to the washroom until they can go home. So there might be a wider variety of experiences that this person shows from having the status quo of this binary choice available to them. Now, of course, the target language is problem solution. So when we bring these two narratives together, we would have the students then summarize the audio. So that's where we're getting some of that problem solution language, because we're both cases talked about a problem, and both cases talked potentially about what those problems were, so that the students can start to think about solutions, or maybe they presented solutions in the audio itself. We can ask then to connect to other groups. So again, how can we get the students who don't identify as either of these women to understand and feel a relationship to this problem? Well, we can ask the students what other people are limited by washroom choices. You might think of disabled people. Sure, in some situations there's a third bathroom, which is a disabled bathroom, but of course, what does that do? That sort of pushes another category of people. You have to go into this one. So even if you identify as a cishet male, but you're in a wheelchair that doesn't fit into the doors or the stalls, you still then have to go to this different washroom. So again, what other people are limited by washroom choices? Another question, how can we improve public washrooms to be accessible and safe for all people? So here we're asking the students then to make a connection to not only people that they don't identify with, but people in their own situations. So how can they make every washroom actually accessible to everybody? They may come up with solutions kind of like these ones, right, where we've got family and all gender washrooms, or potentially that there are campaigns where you're trying to educate the society that whoever's in the washroom belongs there. They know whether they should be in that place or not. But we can then, critique these solutions and talk about whether they actually create any extra problems. And I think that the students would then be able to think of some ideas or some ways in which this causes a problem, even though it's, masked as a solution. So then a final task might then be for the students to identify and improve another social choice. So we've started this whole process with identifying social norms being binary choices, and then asking the students, okay, well, let's move away from the washroom scenario And maybe you can think of a different situation in your own life where there is a social choice that appears to be binary, and maybe we can fix that or change that. And so what might that be? And that gives the students some autonomy to try to work together and think of a different social norm that might be fixable, or at least a solution proposed. So usualizing the array of marginalized folks, as I say, can be complemented by a more disruptive approach. And so when we say disruptive, I'm of course not suggesting that it's super confrontational. What it is using or highlighting the experiences of marginalized people in comparison or as related to a status quo in a way that allows all learners to make a connection to that situation. It raises their awareness of that experience. And it gives them an opportunity to try to think of ways in which they can improve that situation using English for everybody involved, not just the marginalized folks themselves. So we put together all 5 of these ways, and what we end up doing is creating this kind of disruption, right? A space that is beautiful amongst all this concrete. So if we go back to my initial metaphor from long, long ago now, I would argue that A is invisibility, right? A is when we're just happy-go-lucky and not even realizing that there's a problem in terms of inclusion. B is when we have kind of individually woken up and we're starting to try to find ways ourselves to improve a situation. And I think a usualization approach is primarily this, right? It is an individual materials writer's attempt or a teacher's attempt at supplementing materials to include a wider variety of people. And that's great. But then C is more of the more disruptive approach, where we're not only doing B, but we're also including the learners themselves in trying to clean up this mess. And then D would be the ultimate systemic change, where we get the publishers, we get the school administrators, we get the teaching associations, we get employers, we get everybody on board in order to make the changes necessary so that the pollution itself doesn't even start. And so that, of course, would be the ultimate goal of an inclusive approach. So that little yellow graphic just means that's where we are in terms of disruption. So I'd like to end this really by saying, in order to get to that sort of last place, that D, which I think is the biggest systemic change that's necessary, some things need to happen. One first is that we as teachers or materials writers, we have to have a willingness to examine our roles in this situation. We have the power to keep things going in the way that they have always been going, and therefore we have the power to not do that as well. So we do have a certain amount of power, but we have to accept that we have played a role in continuing the marginalization of some learners and teachers and anyway, members of our society in our classes. And once we can accept that, then we can do something about it. We do, of course, need to have inclusive materials, right? So, you know, we can't rely on teachers to supplement and create all these materials themselves. We as materials writers too need to learn how to and create inclusive materials. Of course, we need to have ongoing teacher training. So it's one thing to provide these materials, but it's another thing to actually know how to use them appropriately, and examine the ways in which we approach classes and learners ourselves as teachers. And so having a one-off session kind of like this one is, you know, great, but it's insignificant in comparison to what's actually necessary. So within pre-service teacher programs like CELTA, we need to include units, and significant units, not just a one-day kind of thing, on how to be a representative teacher and an inclusive practices practitioner. But then we need ongoing training after that as well. So not something that is just once and done. And ultimately, to make the biggest change, we need institutional support. And by institutional support, I am talking about major publishers out there. You need to get on board and not succumb to the restrictions that you accept from different countries or different organizations in the world that prevent belonging, inclusion, diversity, representation from happening. But on top of that, schools, you yourselves and the directors of them and the employers of them need to examine your policies, your employment policies, and really support your LGBTQ staff or allies who are trying to, in fact, make change, and give them the support that they need, which includes, clear-cut policy, but also this ongoing training that I'm talking about. Teaching associations need to do the same. Overall, we need to examine why it is and who it is that are the leaders in our teaching associations and what their perspectives are, and whether or not we're maintaining a certain group of people to have the power all the time, or whether we're distributing that power amongst a wider variety of people and voices that need to be heard in order for these things to happen. So we can disrupt the heteronormative status quo of ELT materials together if we do a bunch of these things. I really thank you for even having the interest to be a part of this talk, to listen to me blabble on for a little while, and to potentially pick up my book. So thank you very much, and I really hope to hear from you and get your ideas and see what your inclusive materials are, but also how you can use your power in other ways to change the status quo. Thank you very much.